In 1857, before the Confederacy shot the first shots of the Civil War, before John Brown invaded Harper's Ferry, Frederick Douglass pondered about the means to black social justice. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of struggle. There is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. A fight was inevitable, Douglass assured, if blacks seriously sought freedom. He endorsed African American militancy. As interesting as Douglass's call to arms, he foreshadowed the intellectual trend of future social scientists, historians, psychologists, sociologists, and political scientists. He defined social progress as not driven by the merciful hand of God like many of his contemporaries. Instead, he defined historical stasis as inescapable, yes, if men and women willed to be complacent, and change unavoidable, certainly, if men and women revolted against the moral standards limiting their freedoms. Human agency fueled the evolutionary process, and whether social progress occurred or not, from the struggle, it was a painful and bloody affair. Slave had to murder master, and that crime, immoral in a world determined by masters, potentially ushered in a new world where former slaves ruled tyrannically over their defeated oppressors. Weaknesses transferred from the oppressed to the oppressor, remaining impossible to eradicate, sure, but struggle triggered the transfer of power. When the late 19th century arrived, American intellectuals like John Burgess and John Fiske agreed with Douglass that strength was a necessity to survival. They disagreed, however, that all men and women had access to the same will to survive. The more vigorous, more spiritual, more Christian Anglo-Saxon race was, quote, destined to dispossess many weaker races, assimilate others, and mold the remainder until, in a very true and important sense, it has anglicized mankind. A militant attitude, like that promoted by Douglass, by any race except the superior white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, constituted a physical as well as biological attack on civilization. The feeble races, the Slavs of Eastern Europe, the Romance nations of Southern Europe, the Negroes of Africa and America, the Semitic people of Western Asia and Northern Africa, the Hindus of Central Asia, and the Mongolians of Eastern Asia, lacked any civil rights that the Anglo-Saxons of Middle Europe and the English of Great Britain and America had to respect. John Burgess asserted, quote, not all nations are endowed with political capacity or great political impulse. The highest talent for political organization has been exhibited by the Anglo-Saxon, who dominates the world by his superior political genius. It is therefore not to be assumed that every nation must have self-determination, democracy. The political subjugation or attachment, meaning oppression, of inferior people to those possessing political endowment appears, if we may judge from history, to be natural. Burgess's contention, his argument, was that there existed a whites-only survival of the fittest. The colored-only survival of the fittest required Latin Americans, Asians, and Africans to remain, quote, perfectly and peaceful and harmless, even when threatened by economic and political exclusion. White supremacy manifested itself in the ideology of social Darwinism. Based on Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, intellectuals like Herbert Spencer contended society functioned by the superior individual's will to survive. The inferior expired due to their inability to adapt to the struggle of life. The problem was that those ethnic groups that social scientists define as inferior did not will to live submissively. They were proud. W.E.B. Du Bois affirmed, "We are Negroes, members of a vast historic race. We are the first fruits of this nation, the harbinger of that black tomorrow, which is yet destined to soften the whiteness of the United States. We are that people whose subtle sense of song has given America its only American music, its only American fairy tales, its only touch of pathos and humor amid its mad money-getting plutocracy." Yet it was easy for many Americans to believe during this period that such pride was delusional. It resulted from certain liberal politicians stirring black passions and appealing to black prejudices. The social scientists at the core of the academic movement confidently asserted that racially the Anglo-Saxon and socially the middle class were the strongest, regardless of what contributions other groups donated to U.S. culture. Dr. James Weir Jr. bragged, quote, "If it were not for the restraining influence of the sober, level-headed middle classes, the true police of the world, civilization would be swept from the face of the globe." This positioning of the Anglo-Saxon middle class as authority reflected the dynamics of a segregated society. These social scientists, who were Anglo-Saxon and middle class themselves, established a whites-only manifestation of strength that excluded Africans, Asians, Native, and Latin Americans. It was no wonder that the Niagara Declaration of Principles in 1905 demanded an end to American white society acting the big, more civilized brother. It declared, quote, "At the same time, we believe that this class of African American citizens should protest emphatically and continually against the curtailment of their political rights. We believe in manhood suffrage. We believe that no man is so good, intelligent, or wealthy as to be entrusted completely with the welfare of his neighbor," end quote. This was a direct jab at Anglo-Saxon American paternalism, what was the will to civilize, yet it was difficult to resist this civilization. The whites' only will to survive depended on the superior military power of the industrialized nations. As John Fiske explained to an audience of Harvard students in 1879, this had not always been true. Before Western Europe industrialized, it was common for the civilized to be swept away in a torrent of conquering barbarism. Take ancient Rome, for example. Industrial capitalism, however, had made this impossible. Now, innovative military technology buttressed the role Anglo-Saxons insisted on playing as trendsetters, role models, and lawmakers. Fiske asserted that, quote, "At the present day, the military is almost entirely monopolized by the higher civilization, and it is no longer in danger of being overwhelmed by external violence." This, he predicted, would make it unlikely that the downtrodden would hammer their demands on the heads of their cultivators. Fiske and similar-minded social scientists condemned revolution against the capitalist, industrialized, and democratic world they pioneered because there existed no greater political or economic institutions to substitute. A violent transfer of power was therefore regressive, harmful to everyone involved, but inevitably it exterminated the inferior and feeble people. In the equation solved by academics like Burgess and Fiske, African Americans and other inferiors were dependents and had to be mentored and protected. The oppression and torture imposed by white supremacy were evolutionary growing pains. In fact, this military superiority granted the Anglo-Saxon a monopoly not just on the will to survive, but also on violence. While Africans, Asians, and other so-called lesser people were categorized as barbaric and savage for any violence or civil disobedience that resulted from self-defense, The Anglo-Saxon, one opponent of white supremacy, noted, was, quote, of all the races of men, the most domineering. None have a stronger and more exclusive sense of caste. None have a more contemptuous dislike of inferiority, and none seldom flinched from pursuing murder and widespread devastation of families to justify its fitness to rule. Another critic of a whites-only will to survive called the free markets in money and ideas perpetuated by democracies a, quote, refined barbarism, because the science that granted such societies an innovative edge excluded many ethnic groups from life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The ideology hustled by the Anglo-Saxon was not cooperative and associate, but to compete on the principles of survival of the fittest, regardless of what becomes of his fellow and brother. The end of such counter-arguments was not always to oppose social Darwinism. This was this theory that influenced black, white, yellow, and red scholars alike. The point was to demonstrate the contradiction between the Saxon's ideas and the Saxon's conduct, between what the Saxon professes to be and what the Saxon actually is. A democracy and a free market system that condoned white supremacy with all the exclusions and violence that were derivatives of it was a political and economic sham. By 1881, it was difficult for African Americans, as well as new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe and Asia, to stand their ground because of the discourse promoted by the sciences via social Darwinism. One critic of a whites-only will to survive complained, "Look at the unreasonable and abominable distortion of truth that so many of our brothers in white resort to in order to prove African inferiority. Have they not declared them a race that springs from baboons and apes and can never be the equals of the white race?" Charles Darwin's theory of evolution suggested all humans had descended from lesser animal species. Evolutionary advancements did not apply to Anglo-Saxons alone. William Wells Brown, another critic of white perfection, lectured an audience on ancient Roman history. Quote, "Caesar, in writing home, said of the Britons, 'They are the most ignorant people I have ever conquered.'" Brown then quoted another Roman who contended the Anglo-Saxon, quote, "cannot be taught to read and are the ugliest and most stupid race I ever saw." Brown's purpose here was clear. He intended to demonstrate that the act of defining certain groups inferior was relative. Unfortunately, those counter-arguments never gained wide readership. Part of the control that the Anglo-Saxons gained over the narrative of whites only having the strength to survive without external assistance resulted from the advertisements Americans encountered daily. These perpetuated the idea that people of African ancestry struggled to be white, and not what the reality was, that African Americans and other minorities struggled against white middle-class privilege. An ad for a lotion promised, "Lightens your skin or your money back. Safe, short, quick, Bleachio." Another praised a wonderful gland discovery because it goes straight to the roots and grows beautiful, straight hair. Full, healthy, abundant, without kinks. And another ad vowed that the purchaser of Mr. T's cream would reduce his or her protruding, prominent, thick, unshapely lips to normal and thus improve your facial appearance 100%. Such daily encounters made it seem to average Americans that the inferiority was not something that whites imposed on minorities. However, none of these early advertisers cared to consult the minorities who consumed within these markets. Once they did, the tone of these ads would change overnight. Inferiority was being imposed. The conflict between Douglass on the one end and social scientists like Fisk at the other was not necessarily away from social justice. After all, the social scientists of this era predicted that their racist theories would improve life for minorities. However, the conflict was over the means at the disposal of minorities to adapt and survive a segregated America, where for Douglass, Positive change required the oppressed to struggle for their rights. For Fiske and similar intellectuals, this would have equated to anarchism and a return to primitivism. Instead, what the lesser races needed was protection and mentoring. Theodore Roosevelt said of the United States and the Philippines that Americans had an obligation to uplift Filipinos and prevent them from falling back into savagery. Social Darwinism, through this filter of paternalism, required elites, the intellectually and culturally, quote, enlightened race, to mentor the so-called barbaric. The access to the struggle to survive that minorities had was to submit to Anglo-Saxon middle-class standards of politics, culture, economics, and religion. They lacked access to struggle for a life determined by their specific ethnic standards.